This chapter comes at the end of a book that in some ways we're very familiar with. And yet at the same time, I'd like to imagine what it was like to go back to those places. And if we can relive the experience a little bit this morning. Remember, Jesus had only just a little while ago been crucified. And today we kind of think of crucifixion. We have the sign of the cross, and it's the symbol of faith in Christianity. And yet the crucifixion was an absolutely abhorrent, evil way of dying that was reserved for the worst of the criminals and traitors. And for the Romans, it was an ignominy. And to imagine that the cross, the death of Jesus, has become a symbol of humility, a symbol of obedience, a symbol of sacrifice, and seen as an ideal way of living, is something that's absolutely amazing that has taken place. Christianity and the message of these disciples has changed the world. And it's stories like this chapter that we're looking at today that have been part of that. The death of Christ is overwhelmingly significant. It shows us the love of God. It shows us the reason why Jesus was sent into the world. And yet, it's not just the death that made the difference. Many people have died over the years that thought they were the Messiahs. But it's the resurrection. And today we are seeing further evidence of the resurrection of Jesus. And the sort of Jesus that was raised from the dead, and the way that he wanted to continue his relationships and his ministry with the individuals before that. And so we have the story of Jesus restoring Peter here. But before we do that, let's look at the context. And there are so many different passages and stories that we could be reminded of, and verses. And I'm hoping to give you a few moments in just a little while to touch on some of them that spoke to you. But the first thing that Jesus does in this story is to provide this miracle. The disciples, they were without Jesus. They were gathered by the Lake of Tiberias, which is the Roman name for the Sea of Galilee, and that indicates that, in a sense, that John was writing this book for a Roman audience, for people who weren't necessarily familiar with the local terms that the Jews would have used. And so what we have is these disciples having toiled all night, caught nothing. And it was a reminder to them of the early miracle in which Jesus also came to them one morning and said, "Have you caught nothing?" And told them to throw out the net. And this time the net was full again. But this story is a little bit different. And you know what it's like, that after we've been to the mountaintop, we come down to earth again. And spiritually, we've experienced that. And for the disciples, that's what, in a sense, they've gone through by meeting Jesus. And yet they were back to the normality of normal life. And this time, in their normal life, Jesus came to them and reminded them of what he could do and has done for them. And yet he adds an extra dimension. Not only was it a large number of fish like the first time, a net full of fish, but this time they decided to count the number of fish. And a lot of Christians down through the ages have tried to work out the significance of this number 153. And I've read a bunch of commentaries on this. And yes, there are some fascinating explanations, and to save you the time of going away, I'm not going to present all of those suggestions. but one of the most significant I found was one that a former head of Newbold when I was at Newbold College 35, 40 years ago. I remember a sermon from the head of Newbold at the time, who actually went on to be the president of the General Conference, Dr. Paulson, a wonderful Norwegian man. And he was a scholar. And as he researched this chapter, I can remember in a sermon one day when he was preaching on John 21, he said, 153 was regarded by many Jews at the time of Jesus as the total number of nations that there were in the world, and that by, in a sense, Jesus getting them to catch 153 fish was reminding them of their duty to go to every nation, kindred, and tongue and people. Well, that's one explanation that fits in with the meaning here, although because it's not a biblical explanation, we can't be sure of it. There are others to do with the number 153 and what it meant numerically, but those can be speculations. What I think is quite profound is the way that Jesus chose to take the disciples back with him to earlier experiences. And that is especially the case when he was wanting to restore Peter. I don't know whether you ever use an interlinear or a Greek translation, but I can vaguely remember enough Greek to be able to pick out some of the words that the book was originally written in. And it's fascinating going and checking on the words that Jesus used. And as I might have pointed out elsewhere in my preaching that one or two of you may remember, that there are some words used here in the original language that are not found anywhere else in the New Testament. Do you remember in verse 9, it says that then as soon as they had come back to land, they saw a fire of coals there, as it says in the New King James Version, and the fish laid on it. The fire of coals is basically a charcoal fire. Just like these days, if you're wanting to make a barbecue to cook fish on or to cook anything else on, you don't use just normal wood because they will be smoked to bits and it takes an awful long time and they'll probably be burnt. But charcoal fires are much hotter and they're great for barbecues. And so there was Jesus by the shore making a barbecue. And you think, oh, why does John throw in this extra story here? And it could be, and this is only speculation, but it could be that Jesus wanted to set the scene for Peter's restoration. Because when you come down a few more verses later, and you can imagine the scene after this miracle and all the fish were there wriggling around in the net on the seashore, and they were kind of excited by what's happening. Jesus then invites them to a meal. And why do I talk about this charcoal fire? If you look back to chapter 18 and verse 18, you'll see that the last time Peter might have been around a charcoal fire was at the time of his betrayal. If you look in the other Gospels, it says that Peter was gathered around a fire on the night when Jesus was about to be, when Jesus was being tried. And it was in those other Gospels, it describes how Jesus was being tried, and Peter denied him 3 times. And here, in the Gospel of John 18 and verse 18, it says it wasn't just a normal fire, it was a charcoal fire. A fire on which they were warming themselves, but it has a particular smell. The smell of a charcoal fire is very different from the smell of just a normal working log fire, because people were sometimes putting a bit of food on it, as you can on a fire. They might have even been throwing fish on it as a way of keeping themselves going and fed during the night. And so Jesus chose a reenactment, in a sense, a recreation of an atmosphere that Peter may have drawn back to his memory, that experience of betrayal. And it's in that setting that Jesus asks Peter, "Now, do you love me?" And when he says he loves him, Peter is asked 3 times. Now, if you can imagine the setting of the scene, that it starts off around the fireplace. People are beginning to eat the fish that Jesus had provided, fish that they had not caught. That may be of some significance because the fish was already there. And Jesus was participating with them in that. This was a real resurrected Jesus, not just a disembodied spirit. This is someone who could make food in order to feed them after they'd been working and were obviously hungry after a night's work. And it says, "Feed my lambs." And Jesus responded when Peter said he loved me, "Feed my sheep, feed my sheep." And that sort of restoration, where Jesus takes us back sometimes to the times when we have failed him most, is a powerful reminder of how Jesus cares for the details of our lives. And when we have let him down, he doesn't just want to say, "Oh, you're forgiven. Everything's all right." He wants us to reaffirm our love for him, because that is the most important thing. Jesus wants us to know that after our failure, after our betrayal, after the time we've let him down, that we still do actually love him. I wonder what was most painful for Peter, the moment when he was betraying Jesus or the moment when he was restored. Both experiences were deeply painful in different ways. The first time was a pain of Peter's making. He had a choice there, whether he was going to deny Jesus or whether he was going to accept that he was a true follower, a Galilean who'd known Jesus all this time. But he chose to betray him. And then Jesus chooses to take Peter back to those moments. And Peter, it says, was really upset. By the time Jesus asked him the 3rd time, he was deeply frustrated. And could it be that Jesus, in his love, signified in this way of doing things, that when we have failed Jesus, when we have failed our Lord, he doesn't give us just cheap grace where we just say, "Oh," almost like magic, you pop the words in there, "Forgive me," and everything is forgiven with God. We stand before him. Jesus wants us to learn the lessons of our betrayal and deeply, deeply be reconciled to him. He wants to create the atmosphere that is just right for us, so that we will go through that deep heart-searching process to say, why was it we betrayed Jesus in this setting. I don't know about you, but for me, I've got too many examples of when I've let Jesus down. And I can remember when deeply hurting people, Jesus taking me back and saying, Bernie, how could you be so stupid again? As to fall into that trap, to let yourself get carried away, to be so human when I've called you to something so much better. And yet each time, Jesus has held on to me. And he said, I want to walk with you. Do you really love me? Let's leave this fireplace where it's kind of a bit of uncomfortable at the moment, where this humiliation is so embarrassing publicly. And let's just go for a walk together like Jesus did with Peter. Let's walk away from the others. And even though someone like John may be tagging along behind, wondering what's going on, wanting to hear the story, Jesus takes our reconstitution and recommissioning very personally and says, do you love me? And this is, I believe, the ultimate question for us all, that Jesus is here saying unconditionally, no matter what we have done, he still loves us enough to walk alone with us. And he asks us, do you love me? And in the end, could this be the most profound and deepest question that any of us will ever be asked by Jesus? Do you still love me? And if we do experience that question, what we need to do then is to go on and be recommissioned by Jesus to the great purpose of sharing his good news and his love for all of us.